Very quickly while watching this show, I realized it was going to be very different than the trailers. When this project was first announced, it was one of my least anticipated MCU projects. Just really wasn't excited about an Echo spinoff series from the Hawkeye show. Then, of course, the first trailer dropped, Vincent Donofrio all over it, and the conversation around the show changed. And this show became, personally for me, one of my most anticipated projects of the year. But did it live up to the hype? Starting with what the show did right in bringing back Vincent Donofrio as Wilson Fisk, a bit more back to basics with his character and back to the vibes of the Neftlix Marvel shows a little bit. I gotta say, Vincent Donofrio is one of the best comic book character castings in this era. Putting him in any show, it would be easy for Vincent Donofrio's performance to stand out, but his performance would probably stand out in any show. It's just so damn good. Having Daredevil pop up was great to see. Maybe not what we expected, but it was cool to see. He was out there and involved in Fisk and how her timeline stacks up with the Netflix shows. Still not sure how that quite does. Still have a lot of questions regarding Daredevil in the MCU. We know that now the Neftlix Marvel shows are in fact canon, but we've also seen him portrayed slightly more acrobatic in She-Hulk and at times in Echo like he was portrayed in the comics. And although it could be argued that each version is the same version of Daredevil, so when we get to see Daredevil Born Again, it will be interesting to see which version we get. The 6-minute fight scene that was in the trailer that the Echo director commented on, it was a nice scene, it was fun, it was a nice throwback to the Netflix shows. It was interesting to see a familiar type of scene, but from somebody else's perspective other than Daredevil, and to see it from kind of an enemy perspective in Echo, it was something we don't see often. I also think the fight scene in the Roller Dome might honestly have been even better. And Maya, I did think, was a more interesting character in this show, getting to dive into her abilities and her family, learn more about her backstory, and I do think she was a great new addition to the MCU. I think the addition of the Choctaw people being represented was very refreshing. I wish we could have gotten more Native American shows and movies in general, even outside of the comic book genre or sphere, but the sign language aspect with the whole family, I also really dug being able to communicate with each other around other people who don't know sign. I thought that was cool and it made sense. And that was one of the best emotional grounding tools in this show as well, was Maya's family and their whole dynamic. Yes, their culture, but also how charming and warm some of the characters were, the fractures between them with their history. Although I will say in my cons, maybe we focused a little too much on them at times. It was nice to have a lack of humor, or at least a lack of over-relying on the low-hanging MCU-style humor. There will be still some jokes in here and there in the show, but none that felt super distracting or unearned. Not every joke lands, but also there's not every single character trying to throw out quips, and so it just felt more believable. Now, as soon as episode 1 had ended, I had predicted that we probably weren't going to get the cameos some of us were thinking and predicted, and I was able to predict that Fisk wasn't going to show up until a specific point, and specifically, I predicted he wouldn't show up in episode 2, and unfortunately, that was something that came to be true, and it was something I was a little more mixed on. I don't like being able to watch an episode and then predict how often we're going to see a character throughout the rest of the show, and unfortunately, I had turned out to be correct. It was just predictable for me. Don't get into this show hoping for a ton of Daredevil either, outside of what you've already seen in the trailers. Now, although for the most part, I have enjoyed the fight choreography in this show and what they've done showing us the perspective of a deaf person and what they can do with sound and visuals, I thought was nice to see and interesting. But the fight choreography I felt at times was weird and clunky, and it felt like a Disney Plus show trying to be like the old Netflix Marvel shows, but not quite getting there, just not being quite as clever. Another thing that stood out to me in kind of my mixed category now is I'm not quite sure how I feel about the show and just how short it was. I'm pretty sure it came in around 3.5 hours. None of the episodes came around the hour mark. We had more around the 30 to 35 minute mark. 5 episodes for a character many of us debated, should she even be getting her own show in the first place? And for the sake of the show, they did decide to go 1 episode less than the rest of the Disney Plus Marvel shows. And on the one hand, that means you don't have to stretch out the story and the normal meandering in the middle of most of these MCU series that we've gotten. Might have been stronger in this show if it was longer. But just because it was shorter, it doesn't mean it didn't also suffer from being a little tame at times, like some of the other shows. And although it didn't lose focus necessarily, it did lose some steam going into episode 2 and 3. Now on to the things I just straight up didn't like. The pacing in this show kind of caught me off guard even by the time the first episode ended. I felt halfway through the show like, okay, this isn't what I think anyone expected. I like what they're doing for the Choctaw people. It feels very genuine. However, going into one episode, or going into episode 4 and 5 even, I felt like we were dragging along with a ton of exposition and then once again very quickly wrapping things up in the last few minutes. The story structuring I also felt was very odd. I usually don't have a problem when shows jump between different times, but at times when they did multiple flashbacks, it was hard sometimes to pinpoint exactly what time era we were watching unless an obvious date came on screen. I just felt like it was kind of clunky, the way the story was formatted, the way it was jumping back and forth between different flashbacks. It wasn't necessarily a bad story to tell, but again, I'm not sure if it would have benefited from being shorter or being longer, but it definitely could have benefited from having more time to tell its story in the first couple episodes if it didn't have just 5 episodes total, and with the shorter run times. Also, if it didn't have the job of catching people up through flashbacks in the first episode, which I didn't mind, especially for a new viewer, but it also showed me just how jarring it must have felt for a new viewer that had never seen Wilson Fisk before or hadn't seen the Hawkeye series before. I'm sure they felt more caught up, but at what cost of the storytelling? You can do as many flashbacks and exposition dumps as you want, but it doesn't necessarily get us emotionally invested in Maya just seeing emotionally trying times in her life, one after another. I also thought some of the side characters or side henchmen were kind of kooky. The show overall just wasn't that exciting as I wanted it to be. Granted, I still enjoyed the show, but it wasn't thrilling, it wasn't very suspense-driven, and although I was invested in the characters, the family, the story between Maya and Wilson Fisk, they just had this whole father-daughter relationship and history to set up in so little time, introduce Maya's family, their history, the ancestors, the plot. There's just so much to do, so little time. Without going into spoilers, there is a scene in the finale where I felt it got kind of lame in a couple of different moments that they thought would have been really cool, that they were trying to be really edgy and different, and it's moments we've seen before in multiple other projects, most notably in the first Shazam movie with his family dynamics in the third act against the villain. It was very reminiscent of Echo to me with her powers and how it's connected to her family and history. From a visual standpoint, the quick cuts to what almost looked like dream sequences from the ancestors of one of our main characters, just from an editing and visual standpoint alone, felt very jarring. I also felt like just the way it was quick cuts. I also felt like, again, we've kind of seen that story be told dozens of times before, where we have our ancestors rooting for us from the beyond, and in our time of need, they give us the strength to carry forward and be victorious. I also felt that the way they wrapped up Wilson Fisk and Maya's final confrontation just felt so unbelievably quick and anticlimactic. It was even confusing too. And that's partially due to the fact that it's part of a cinematic universe, so we know a lot of these characters are going to be appearing again in the upcoming projects, so they can't die here, but you can still have stakes without everyone needing to die, and I just felt like there weren't really any. I also felt like if you didn't watch this show, for better or for worse. You won't be lost on the next MCU outing, as they claim. You don't need to have watched any other show to understand this one, but I think it also works the other way around in the fact that you could skip this show, even being a big Kingpin fan, and be just fine moving forward. Now, that's an assumption, obviously. I haven't seen the next MCU project, but that's just the vibes I'm getting currently, and when you take a look at these characters and the state they are in, other than location and maybe some minor changes to their emotional state, not a whole lot has changed from the start of this show to the end of it compared to where we see these characters last in the finale to Hawkeye. Echo is well-produced, well-acted MCU Disney Plus series, and with the story introducing some great new characters, Maya in being one of them, had a refreshing tone compared to the rest of the MCU, more adult-themed with the TVMA rating. It's the first to be released under the Marvel Spotlight banner, so you shouldn't have to watch anything previously to follow along. But unfortunately, this show suffers when it comes to pacing and story, which is oftentimes much more important. And so, as much as I want to love it, and as much as I love Wilson Fisk, and even in this show, and there's a lot I appreciated about this series, it ends up being frustrating and not totally satisfying. I do think it benefits from not being the average MCU show and having a ton of quips and jokes that fall flat, a big CGI fight at the end. But other than Kingpin, there's not a whole lot in here for me that screams rewatch value. What are your thoughts on the Echo series? Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and until next time, have a great day.